Good morning. We're going to talk about Your Eyes Are Watching God essay a little bit right now. So if I were you, I'm not, but if I was, I would get my notes/notebook out, maybe jot a couple things down. If you're thinking of writing the symbols paper, since each of those symbols, both the pear tree and the mule, only show up so many times in the book. You know, the mule is mentioned by Nanny. It's mentioned also again with Logan. Then you have the mule stuff in Eatonville, but that's about it, right? Tea Cake addresses a little bit of that with some of the food and stuff he brings her later, but I would start by writing down all the instances where that idea shows up, right? And since it only shows up in a couple different places, I would try to bring in as much of that content about the mule as possible into your argument. I would also probably do the same thing for the pear tree. You know, you could talk about how these are both symbols of Janie or represent Janie or something to that effect. But the pear tree also only shows up so many places. So you might, at least before you start, do a little brainstorming and kind of look at the number of times each of those symbols shows up in the book and then write down the places where it does. And you can kind of get a sense of, do I have enough to write about for a full essay on one of these symbols, or would it be better to do both? So start by gathering all your evidence on that. The second one, gender roles, is Janie a strong character? I think this makes for a good paper because sometimes I think the best arguments are ones that are a little bit more challenging to prove. They make for better papers than taking an argument which is a bit more clear-cut and explaining it. Sometimes, even though that sounds weird, it can be a little bit tougher to write that paper. So with Janie, I think there's quite a bit of evidence on both sides. I think I would tend to lean that she is a strong character. But if you were going to make that argument, whichever side of the argument you're going to make, strong or weak, you'll need to try to explain away some of the contrary evidence on that. So, for instance, you know, if you're writing that she's a strong character, there's times that she, you know, either puts up with things that maybe she shouldn't, or where she doesn't speak up for herself, or things like that you would need to kind of explain away, right? If you were just writing about she becomes a strong character, that could be a good paper topic too. Just make sure that paper is about trying to come up with what caused her to become strong, right? What was it? Either that, not just the experiences she went through, because if your argument for your paper is Janie changes because of the experiences she went through, the problem is you're just telling me what happened in the book, right? That's the things she went through are what changed her. But if you could come up with either something she learned, right, or something she discovered about herself, or something to that effect, some reason, some catalyst that caused her to change, that would work well. And then just make sure you bring in some of the contrary information on that. So again, as with the symbols, start with brainstorming and looking at the evidence you have, the times in the stories, and you could, you know, use some online summaries to try to track down some of these places. But incident she has with Joe, incident she has with Tea Cake, and incident she has with Logan, which you could talk about to describe whether she's strong or not. Money and power. This argument, if you're going to do this one, this is kind of similar to the paper that I wrote for my grad paper. You can start with, you know, what Nanny says to Janie about why she's marrying her off to Logan, right? Nanny had this idea, and partially because she lived a lot of her life during slavery, but if you marry someone who has land or money, that you will be safe, right? And you won't be able to be taken advantage of, and you won't be able to be treated badly, right? That's the money is kind of the protecting thing. What you're doing here is looking at the way each of these husbands treats her, right? And kind of also in accordance to how much money they have. We've talked about this one quite a bit as we've gone through the book, so you should have quite a bit of evidence for that. Excuse me. But you're writing about how, kind of based on the amount of money that her husbands have, in a sense they're proving Nanny wrong, right? Because the more money that her husbands have, the worse they treat her. So again, you'd be gathering some evidence and kind of drawing some conclusions there. And then lastly, speech, storytelling or speech. Joe wants to become a big voice, right? So I might start with that and kind of define what that means to Joe, right? He's got a certain idea in his mind of what he wants to be. And not that, I don't think Janie wants to be that exactly, but it's Janie's power of speech and power of speaking up for herself and telling her own story, which, you know, she is doing throughout this whole thing, even though through a lot of the book she kind of keeps a lot of the feelings that she has and stuff that she goes through to herself, especially when things are really bad with Joe. That's the case. So you'd be looking about how she learns to use her voice and become that important person that Joe wanted to be, right? And she could be this for the whole town. You know, if you look at, you know, if you accept the idea that she kind of becomes that as we move through the book, and then you look at the way she feels about, you know, the treatment that she gets from the townspeople. When she walks back into town, they're making very judgmental comments about her because they're assuming that they know what happened to her, right? She knows that that didn't happen, and she knows that if they knew what had happened to her, they wouldn't be saying these things. And she could go through the process of telling them, the whole town, this whole story, right? Which I think would be a useful one because I think it's a lesson that she's learned. But she doesn't because they've treated her so badly, so she just doesn't care about any of them, really. So with Big Voice, you'd be looking about how Janie learns to use her voice and become that important person that Joe wanted to be. So again, with all of these, I really want to encourage you, before you start just diving in to write, do a little planning and thinking about, you know, what you're going to bring into your paper, how you're going to prove this point, right? You come up with the argument you're going to make, and then you're looking for the best evidence in the book and the best way that you can explain how that evidence is going to prove the thesis that you're arguing. So if you can do some of that planning and kind of pre-thinking in advance, lay out, first of all, specifically what your thesis is and be able to put that down in words, not just generally I know what the idea is, but be able to pin down what the words are for that. Then lay out the topics that you'll cover in that essay, right, to prove that point. And then going through all the quotes and evidence that we gathered during discussion of the book, lay out the specific quotes that would fit with those parts of the argument that you're making. Once you've done that, then your paper is going to be really easy to write because you know what you're going to be writing about and the order you're going to be writing about it and all the evidence you're going to use, right? And whether you're writing, you know, a 3 or 4 page paper in here or a 10, 15 page paper in college, the same process works, right? And it will save you a lot of time because if you just sit down and start writing, before you've done this kind of pre-thinking, one, you could get to a place in your argument where the argument hits a dead end and you're stuck, right? And that's less likely to happen in a 3, 4 page paper. But as you get to college, if, as I said, if you have a 10 page paper and you get 5, 6 pages in and realize you don't have anywhere to go, you just wasted a bunch of time, right? So try to do some planning in advance. I will be here tomorrow for conferences. I've got a kid with a fever, and so doing the best we can. But I will be here tomorrow. We will have computers Thursday and Friday, and papers still due Monday. So I will see you tomorrow. Good luck.